Thanks so much for joining us today. God wants to do so much for you and through you, and we'd love to hear about it. Take a moment to send your story to stories@parkerhill.org. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, you can do that by going to parkerhill.org/give and choose the giving option that works best for you. Well, thanks for joining us. We hope you enjoy today's message.
Welcome, everybody. Great to have you guys here this weekend as we continue this teaching series called For NEPA. And if you're brand new to Parker Hill, you may not realize that we are what's called a multi-site church, which means we're one church that meets in 3 locations. And every weekend we share the teaching across all 3 locations by way of video. So let me give a big shout out to those of you joining us by video at our Clark Summit campus, our Wilkes-Barre campus, and those of you in your pajamas watching online. Great to have you here as well. This teaching series is called For NEPA, and that title, that little phrase, really just is a way to describe what we aspire to be as a church as we move into the future. And here's what it means. It means that we want to be the kind of church that's known by what we're for instead of being known by what we're against, because we think there are just too many churches who are known only for what they are against. And so we want to be the kind of church that moves beyond the walls of a building out into our community to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to love and serve and bless our neighbors, and in the process to draw them to the heart of God. And all of that is captured in that phrase, For NEPA. It describes the kind of Christ followers we want to be individually and the kind of church that we want to be collectively. But today, as we continue this conversation, I want to talk about the power of perspective, because I believe that if we are going to be Christians like that and be a church like that, we may need to change our perspective. And perspective is a powerful thing. As we talk about it, let me begin with a definition. Perspective is a particular attitude toward or way of regarding something. It is a point of view. And it's interesting how different people can experience the same thing and come away with different conclusions, all based on perspective. In fact, I want to show you a few images that will demonstrate the power of perspective. So wherever you are right now, turn to somebody next to you and tell them what you see in this image. Go ahead, tell them what you see on the screen. What is that? All right, so a lot of you would look at that and you would say, well, that's a vase or it's some kind of container. But some people would look at that and they would see 2 faces in silhouette looking at each other. See, it's all a matter of perspective. Let's try another one. What do you see in this image? What is that? Yeah, actually what that is that's a leaf, but looking at that, you might think it's a pair of lips. It's all a matter of perspective. I'll give you one more. What is this picture? Tell somebody next to you. What is that? Yeah, that's actually a church, but if you stand right at that point and get that perspective, it looks like a chicken. Yeah. So it's all a matter of perspective. It's very interesting to me how different people can look at the same thing, and through a different lens, through a different perspective, they can come away with different conclusions. In fact, I heard a story about a husband and a wife who each had their own personal journal, and they would write something in their journal at the end of every day. And so on one particular day, this is what the wife wrote in her journal. Tonight, my husband was acting weird. We had made plans to meet at a nice restaurant for dinner. Conversation wasn't flowing, so I suggested that we go somewhere quiet so we could talk. I asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. I asked him if it was my fault that he was upset. He said he wasn't upset, that it had nothing to do with me and not to worry about it. On the way home, I told him that I loved him. He smiled slightly and kept driving. When we got home, he just sat there quietly and watched TV. Finally, with silence all around us, I decided to go to bed. About 15 minutes later, he came to bed, but I still felt that he was distracted and his thoughts were somewhere else. He fell asleep. I don't know what to do. That was her journal. This is what her husband wrote in his journal. Rough day, boat wouldn't start, can't figure out why. 2 people, same day, very different perspective on it. Yeah, that's the power of perspective. And see, if we're going to be a church that's not just in northeastern Pennsylvania, but we are for northeastern Pennsylvania, then we all have to be on the same page as far as perspective. And we have to have God's perspective. I think we have to have God's perspective, first of all, on people. We have to see people around us in our community the way that God sees them and the way that He loves them. We also have to have the right perspective on our lives, and we have to recognize that we are here not just to be served by others, but we are here to serve because we follow history's ultimate servant, which is Jesus himself. And third, I think we've got to have the right perspective on our material possessions. We've got to see our resources in light of eternity. We've got to have the right perspective if we're going to be the people that we are called to be. So today, as we talk about perspective, I want to focus your attention on the words of Jesus as he was teaching in Luke chapter 12, and he was teaching about the subject of perspective. Just to give you a little context here, the book of Luke, it was written by a follower of Jesus in the first century, thoroughly researched the life of Christ, and then he put together this account called the Gospel of Luke, the story of Jesus. And here in chapter 12, Jesus was teaching a large crowd of people, but then right in the middle of his teaching, somebody in the crowd interrupts him. Verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So apparently this guy was caught up in a family squabble over money, and he wanted Jesus to step in and sort it out. And so Jesus turns this interruption into an opportunity to teach this crowd about priorities and about perspective. First of all, he turns to this man and he addresses him. Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" In other words, I'm not going to get involved in that. I'm not here in this world to solve your financial problems. And then he turns to the crowd and he gives them a warning. And he said to them, the crowd, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions." Let that sink in. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And I'll tell you what, if they needed to hear that in the first century, how much more do we need to hear that in the 21st century? Because we live in a culture where we are told every single day that life does consist in an abundance of possessions. We live in a world where we are told every single day that the pursuit of material things will fill an emptiness inside of us. And so we chase after more and more and more, thinking that happiness, that satisfaction is out there somewhere, but it's just beyond our reach. And we spend our lives, waste our lives, trying to find it. Jesus said life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And as I was reading that, I couldn't help but think about a man by the name of Marcus Persson. Marcus is a Swedish software designer, and he invented a software gaming program years ago called Minecraft. It was very, very popular. It still is very popular. But in 2014, he sold his company, Minecraft, to Microsoft, and he walked away with a check for $1.3 billion. Now, if money could make you happy, certainly $1.3 billion should do the trick, right? But a couple of years after that, he was on Twitter early one morning, and he posted a series of tweets. And here's what he said: 4:48 a.m., the problem with getting everything is you run out of reasons to keep trying. 2 minutes later, hanging out with a bunch of friends and partying with famous people, able to do whatever I want, and I've never felt more isolated. Found a great girl, but she's afraid of me and my lifestyle, and went with a normal person instead. That just echoes the words of Jesus. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. Be on your guard, he said. And then just to drive this point home, Jesus goes on to tell a story. He tells a parable, and it's a parable about perspective. Here's what he says, and he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" And Jesus ends by saying, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God." Now, I think the most remarkable thing about this parable is that this man in the parable that Jesus describes as a fool, most every person would look at that man and say that he is an enormous success. He worked hard, he planned well, he accumulated wealth. Now he's enjoying the rewards of his labor. He is like the ultimate American success story. But God describes him as a fool. Why? Well, it wasn't because he worked hard. It wasn't because he had great success. It wasn't because of his wealth. He is described as a fool in this parable because he had the wrong perspective. And he had the wrong perspective in three specific areas of his life. First of all, he had the wrong perspective on his success. Jesus begins this parable, and he says this in the very first line in verse 16, "The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest." The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. It's very interesting to me the way that Jesus begins that story. He doesn't say a man worked hard to produce an abundant harvest. He says the ground produced it. What he's doing, and Jesus was very intentional in his teaching, he's shifting the focus from what the man did to what God had done. And we all know that farmers have to work very hard to produce a harvest, but the attention here is on what God had done. God who created the ground. The God who produced just the right conditions of rain and sunshine to produce this abundant harvest. It's very God-focused. But then, look at the contrast in the next few verses. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones there. I will store all my surplus grain, and I'll say to myself," where was his focus? On himself. In whose eyes, in his eyes, who do you think got the credit for his great success? He did. It's so interesting. This man was a fool, but he was a fool because his success became a mirror in which he only saw himself, instead of becoming a window through which he saw the grace of God. And instead of recognizing God's grace and goodness in his life, he's very focused on himself. And let me tell you this, in your lifetime, you may enjoy a measure of what this world calls success. And if and when that happens, never forget that it's only by the grace of God. If you're beautiful, if you're talented, if you're strong, if you're wealthy, it is only because God has allowed you to be beautiful, talented, strong, or wealthy. And when we fail to remember the true source of our success and our blessings in life, pride begins to well up in our hearts and we become filled with a sense of entitlement. I remember one day years ago, I was having lunch with one of my daughters at McDonald's and I got her some French fries. And I tried not to eat French fries because I have high cholesterol, but I'm sitting there and her French fries smelled really good and they looked really good. So I instinctively reached over and took some of her French fries and I ate them. And my daughter immediately said, "Dad, don't touch my fries. Those are my French fries. Keep your hands off my fries." She had forgotten something. She had forgotten that about 10 minutes before that, I had walked up to the counter and I had reached into my pocket and taken out my money and bought her those French fries. I was the supplier of the fries. She seemed to have forgotten that. She also failed to reckon with the fact that if I wanted to, I could go back up to the counter and buy 20 bags of French fries. I could bury her in French fries if I wanted to. So I didn't need her French fries. I just wanted her to share what I had so freely given to her. Now, let me tell you what the height of ingratitude is. The height of ingratitude is when God gives us so many blessings and we act as if we've gotten them on our own. And we essentially say, "Don't touch my fries." See, this man in this story that Jesus told, he was a fool. And he was a fool because he had the wrong perspective on his success and where his success came from. But he was also a fool because he had the wrong perspective on his life. Let me go back again to verse 19. "I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you." I want you to see the contrast here. This man looked at his future and he said, "Many years." God looked at his future and said, "This very night." This man was a fool because he failed to take into account the uncertainty and the brevity of life. From his perspective, he had plenty of time left. From God's perspective, his time was up. As I was reading this, I couldn't help but think about the story of a man named Coleman Mockler. Coleman Mockler was the CEO of the Gillette Razor Company for 16 years, from the mid-'70s through the early '90s. He was a very effective leader, and under his leadership, the company became very, very profitable. In fact, the value of the company's stock grew 50-fold during his 16 years as the CEO of that company. He was so effective as a leader that Forbes magazine decided to write a story about him and his success in the corporate world, and they put his picture on the cover of the upcoming issue. A few days before the magazine went out for sale, they gave him an advance copy of it. They actually delivered it to his office. And when the magazine showed up at his office, his staff gathered around, they all looked at it, and then they applauded for him because he was such a great success on the cover of Forbes. And as they're applauding, he takes the magazine and he walks down the hall to his office, closes the door behind him. He wanted to savor this moment and sit down at his desk and just read through the article. I mean, he had arrived. He was at the top of his career. So he closes the office door. He's walking over to his desk, and he falls to the floor. And within moments, he was dead of a massive heart attack, still holding the magazine in his hands with his face on the cover. See, life is uncertain. Life is unpredictable. Life is brief. That's why I believe that one of the most dangerous words in the English language is the word someday. Someday I'll get serious about serving God. Someday I'll really get serious about becoming the person that God is calling me to be. Someday I'll make a difference in this world. Someday I'll become a generous person. Someday. But what happens is that life moves quickly and we get busy and things come up and we get off track. And for far too many people, someday never arrives. Today is the day to serve Christ. Today is the day to make a difference. And the man in this parable was described as a fool because he failed to recognize the brevity and the uncertainty of life. He had the wrong perspective on his life, the wrong perspective on his success, and he had the wrong perspective on his material possessions. Jesus gives this closing statement after telling this parable, verse 21. He said, "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God." So the problem with this man, the thing that made him foolish, was not the fact that he was rich. There's nothing wrong with being rich. It can be a sign of God's blessing. The problem was not that he was rich. The problem was that he was not rich toward God. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to be rich toward God? Well, I believe that we become rich toward God when we take a portion of the resources that he, first of all, has given to us, and we put them into things that matter to the heart of God. We become rich toward God when instead of using our money and possessions just to keep score, and using our money and possessions just to make our lives more comfortable and increase our standard of living, that we begin to use some of those things to bless other people and to advance God's kingdom. Then we become rich toward God. Jesus said something very, very similar in another message that he gave in Matthew chapter 6, which is part of what we call the Sermon on the Mount. He said, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal." Store up treasures in heaven. That's how you become rich toward God. And I'm sure you've heard the old saying, you can't take it with you. You can't take it with you. But do you know what Jesus is saying? He's saying you can't take it with you, but you can send it on ahead. You can actually store up treasure in heaven. Let me give you an example of what that might look like. This is a picture of a young lady by the name of Sharon. Sharon is 13 years old, and she lives in the village of Tumutumu, Kenya. She has 3 brothers, and she and her 3 brothers and her mom live there, and they live in a mud hut with 3 rooms. They have no electricity, no running water. They have no television, no computer. They have no automobiles. My family and I have the privilege of supporting Sharon through an organization called 410 Bridge so that she can go to school and receive an education and hopefully break the cycle of poverty in her family. Our family is one of about 150 families in this church that sponsor kids in the country of Kenya, either in Tumutumu or our other partner village there. And sponsoring Sharon for our family, that means we have to give up some things in our budget. It's not a lot, but we have to give some things up, a little bit of stuff that we don't have. But here's the trade-off. Sharon has become a Christian. She's become a follower of Christ. And so someday, we may never see her on this earth, but someday we will see her in heaven. And not only her, but perhaps even her children and her grandchildren as she passes on her faith to succeeding generations. See, that's treasure in heaven that can never be taken away. My cars, they're rusting as we speak. Eventually, they'll end up in a junkyard. My clothes eventually will be worn out, probably given away. The house that we live in right now, eventually it'll be sold. Someone else will own it. All of that is earthly treasure. It all stays here. How much heavenly treasure do you have? That's the question. Are you rich toward God? See, the man Jesus describes in this parable, he left this world with lots of treasure in his barns, but no treasure in heaven. Now, you and I aren't struggling with whether or not to build bigger barns to store up our grain. We as Americans have a different version of building bigger barns, don't we? For us, it's not building bigger barns to store our grain, it's upgrading to the next bigger house. It's trading in for the next nicer car or cars that we want to get. It's the more exotic vacation. It's fancier dinners. It's the second home. It's the lake house. It's all of that. And those things aren't bad. They're not bad. But here's my caution. My caution is this, that we can get to the end of our very brief lives and look back and realize that almost everything that God gave us was just consumed. It was just consumed. It never did anything of eternal value. In fact, there's an assumption that I think most Americans have. It's what I call the consumption assumption. If it comes to me, it must be for me. In other words, if God allows me to have it, if it comes into my life, it must be for my comfort, my benefit. It must be for me to consume. I think that's a deeply faulty assumption if you're a follower of Christ, and I think it's the wrong perspective to live by. I think what we need is what I would call a wartime perspective. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Back during World War II, the government printed a series of posters and displayed them in public places as a way to remind people to support the war effort by being very careful about how they used resources. Because in order for us to fight the war that we had to fight during World War II, it took a tremendous amount of our resources. And if people used all the resources for their own personal comfort and convenience, then there wouldn't be enough resources for the more important goal that we had nationally, which was victory in that war. So do with less so they'll have enough. Use it up, wear it out, make it do. Here's the parallel. I believe that we as followers of Christ, we as a church, are also engaged in a battle. It's a battle for the hearts and the souls of people. And if we are willing to make some personal sacrifices, then the resources necessary to win that battle will be in the hands of the God who's fighting along with us. So here's how I want to apply this as we talk about perspective and the right perspective, a perspective on success. It comes from God, first of all. A perspective on life. It's short, it's brief, it's uncertain. Perspective on material possessions that they're not just for us, they're for us to leverage for eternal purposes. As we look to the future as a church, we want to be able to bless and serve our community in even bigger ways. That we want to be a church that is for northeastern Pennsylvania, and if we're going to do that, then we can't just keep building bigger barns for ourselves, that we've got to be generous with people around us. So we have some very ambitious goals that we've set for ourselves over the next 3 years. First one is this: over the next 3 years, we want to increase our investment in our community by $250,000 over the next 3 years, that we want to just do some things in northeastern Pennsylvania that will meet some very practical needs, bless the socks off of our neighbors, and open a conversation about the hope that we have. And we do some great things already, like Night to Shine, Backpack Project, Diaper Duty, Bundle Up. Keep doing all those things, but we want to do even more and go even deeper. And then the second thing that we want to accomplish over the next 3 years is we want to pay off the balance of our construction loan, the loan that was used to renovate the movie theater in Dixon City and our campus in Clark Summit. Once we do that, we can free up over $200,000 in our annual budget, which will allow us to make an even bigger difference here in northeastern Pennsylvania. So if you haven't gotten one of these view books yet, grab one on your way out. This describes all the details of this vision over the next 3 years. Grab a copy of that, really well put together by our staff. It will give you all the details. And then next week, we're going to invite you to join us in what we call a 3-year generosity challenge. Now, as I've said every week during the series, if you're a guest here, this is not for you. We're not asking you to do anything. You can listen in because this actually is for you, and it's for other people in northeastern Pennsylvania who do not yet have a church. We want to be able to be a blessing to our community. So next weekend, we're going to invite you to jump in with us in this 3-year generosity challenge. So we want you to take one more week to really think and pray and consider what your part may be. And our goal in all of this is 100% participation. So if you would say, this is my church, we'd love to see you jump in with us for a couple of reasons. Number one, because this is ambitious, and in order to do this, we're going to have thousands of people who play whatever part God calls them to play. And secondly, if you would describe this as your church, we want you to have a stake in our future. So when we begin to do these projects throughout the community, we want you to be able to say, hey, I'm a part of that. When you see a story on a video screen in a church service about God changing somebody's heart through this church, we want you to be able to say, you know what? I'm a part of that. I'm a stakeholder in that. Now, I don't know what participation looks like for you. That's different for every person because in God's eyes, generosity is never measured by what we give. It's measured by what we give in relationship to what He, first of all, has given to us. But I do want to give you something to think about this week. Here's what I want you to think about this week. In a church like ours, we have people at every step in what I would call the generosity journey. And I want to talk about 4 different levels of generosity and ask you to identify where you are and then think and pray about taking a step up this ladder. So the first level is what I would call a potential giver. This would be somebody who says, I believe in the vision of Parker Hill, but do not yet give on a regular basis. And that may be you if you're listening to this, that you love the church, you're engaged here, you're plugged in, your kids love it, but you've not yet gotten on board financially. This is the perfect time to start this habit in your life because you can help us write the next chapter in our story. The next level up from that would be what I call an intentional giver. That's somebody who says, I give regularly and consistently to the work of Parker Hill. And you've made this a habit of your life. You've built this into your budget. Let me encourage you to think and pray about what this next 3 years could look like for you as you trust God to be a part of this vision. The next level up is what I would call a proportionate giver, where somebody says, I give a percentage of my income to the work of Parker Hill, because whenever Scripture talks about generosity, it always talks about it in terms of a percentage. We like to look at numbers because numbers can be impressive, but a percentage is more important. And the percentage that Scripture often talks about is what's called a tithe. That's the pattern. It means 10%. And maybe you're at the point where you want to look at your giving not as an amount, but as a percentage of all the income that comes into your life, whatever percentage that is. And then the last level is what I would call extravagant giving. I give over and above a tithe of my income, and many people will do that over the next 3 years to help us realize this vision, which I believe is a God-given vision. So this week, think about that. On your seat as you came in, there's a card that looks like this. We've been handing this to you every single week. Go ahead and grab that. We do not want you to fill it out this week. We just want to make sure you have a copy so you can spend this next week reading it, becoming familiar with it, thinking about it, praying about it, and then being ready to make a decision next weekend if you call this your church. Now, you may wonder, why do we use a commitment card? Simple reason, that just helps us to plan accurately for the future and know what the future could hold. This is not a contract. We realize that things change in people's lives over a 3-year period. This is a reflection of what you intend to do and what you plan to do. It helps us to plan. As you think about this, if you're married, you need to talk to your spouse about this. We do not want to create any marriage problems, okay? You need to get on the same page. You may think about this and say, man, I'd love to be a part, but man, my finances are so upside down. I don't know how I could do that. Inside, there's some creative ways to create some financial margin. Let me encourage you to look at that. And then next spring, we have a class called Financial Peace University that will help you to get some of those things in a better place. So the next time God prompts you to be generous, it'll be easier for you. Okay? So ultimately, what this is all about is not dollars and cents. It's not about that at all. It's ultimately about people. About 555,000 people that live in northeastern Pennsylvania, this 3-county area, that I believe God has called us to bless and to reach with the greatest message of hope that history has ever heard. And I was thinking about this because we just come out of a very heated political season with midterm elections. And I don't know about you, but I'm really glad to get a break from the political advertising on TV, the commercials. I'm glad to be free of that for a while. Our country spent $5.2 billion on this midterm election, $1.4 billion more than the last midterm election. Now, I'm glad we get to participate in the electoral process. I love our country. I love the freedoms that we have, and I voted. I sure did. But here's what I want us to understand in terms of perspective. The deepest problems that we face as a nation can never be solved by government. We can have the best health care plan we can come up with. We can have the perfect tax system. We can have the greatest political leaders. But none of that will ever change a human heart or heal a broken family, or give someone hope in the face of death. It is God, not government, that can change a human heart. And the United States and all of its political leaders will eventually be a footnote in history. But God's kingdom will never end. That's why what we do here is so important, because it's eternally important. And I just think we need to keep that in perspective. And so I've spent the last few minutes talking about strategies and dollars and things like that. I don't want to end there. I want us to end by thinking about people, because again, that's what this is ultimately about. So for the next few minutes, don't go anywhere because the service isn't over yet. I just want you to watch a video with me, drink this in, because this will be a moment of perspective for us. I want you to think about your life, and when you leave this world behind, how much of your treasure will you have sent ahead? And how much of it will you leave here? What will your legacy be? Let's watch this together. What was it that prompted you to give and be a part of those opportunities?
Tithing has been just a part of our lives. And so when it came to the different campaigns, I think it was just a natural extension of the tithe. That was just, if Parker Hill, feels that this is something important, we want to be all in. We want to be on board with what the vision is for the church and for the future.
Ever since you've made the decision to be generous, how have you seen God provide for your needs?
Well, we've never gone hungry.
We've never gone hungry. And we always kind of had that feeling is like, this is, our gift to God is a real priority in our lives. I kind of go back, we always kind of like that struggle hasn't been so bad because we're kind of like, okay, this is meant to be, this is what we're supposed to do, and then we'll figure out what we do with the rest. And some months, it gets a little cool in the house sometimes, but it's okay.
What is most encouraging to you about what you see in the church as the result of your generosity?
I love the Wilkes-Barre campus. Huh. The fact that the leadership team was willing to dive into that, that was, courageous, but I think it also showed a lot of faith, for all of us to say, we're going out of our comfort zone.
It's just great to see the kids who come to know Christ through, student ministries. The baptisms is so cool. When you see some of the stories on the big screen, I feel like our giving maybe played a little part in bringing some of those people to church and to know God. And so I feel like it's like a little bit of like a privilege to be able to be a part of something that's much bigger than we are.
My reason for inviting you here tonight was just to say thank you for investing in the work of God's kingdom in this church. And for me to say thank you is okay. but I thought it'd be great for some other people to say thank you as well. Kind of like a surprise party where people show up that you weren't expecting.
Oh, no.
So years ago, you guys decided to make a commitment to God's work in this place financially, and hundreds of lives have been affected by that. And a few of those people just wanted a chance to personally say thank you for your generosity.
Hi.
My name's Sarah. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Too. Growing up, I didn't go to church regularly. I only really remember going like 1 or 2 times. I mean, my parents, they told me about God, and I believed in God, but I didn't really know God. When I turned 15, that's when everything changed. My dad, he passed away from cancer, and I was devastated. It felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling and I was free falling. When I was 17, I got my first job, and the boss, he was a corrupt man, and he got me to trust him, and then he sexually abused me for about 5 months. I felt alone, and I felt scared, and I felt ashamed. And I had a friend that went to Parker Hill, and she invited me to go with her. I did, and it was amazing. I knew I loved Parker Hill from the moment I walked in. Everyone was so welcoming, and they weren't judging, and they were not labeling me at all. Parker Hill just means everything to me. Like, through Parker Hill, I've gotten baptized, I've gone to Haiti, I've made healthy relationships with people who pour into me and inspire me and encourage me. And my relationship with God is better than I could have ever imagined it to be.
Sarah, we're happy you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm so thankful for you guys.
Your gifts
Thank you.
make this a better place.
Guys.
Hi, how are you?
My name is Devin.
Hi, Devin.
Devin.
4 years ago, I was an atheist. My friend Caden brought me to church for the first time. Since then, everything really has changed. Right off the bat, I was so skeptical. Why would God do this for me? Or what are these people singing about at 3D?
Yeah.
For some reason, was kept drawn to come back. And through time, I eventually went on my first fall retreat, which was where I gave my life to Christ.
That's awesome.
Last year, I got baptized with the church. I continue to be at 3D as I'm a small group leader now.
Yep.
And I hope that I can continue to affect the students and people around me. So I just want you guys to know that even if you didn't realize it at the time, that generosity that you give is going to affect not only me, but the generation of students to come.
That's great to hear. Thank you. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, we're
How are
good.
you? So my name is Karen Walsh.
Hi, Karen.
And I am a wife and a mom of 4 fantastic kids. In November of 2010, I was a mom of 3 small children, and I was separated from my husband of 11 years. It left us very resentful, bitter, and really just unable to love one another. And I thought that there was just nowhere to go. You know, it was truly the end. I had spent more time pretty much on my knees crying for myself than I had praying. And I thought I could do it all myself. I could control it, I could fix it. It was then I really knew what was missing. This random woman came up to me and started talking to me about Parker Hill. And I ended up there the very next day. And I walked through these very same doors, completely lost. It opened my heart and allowed me to give up my struggles and just to pray that God would just show me the path, whatever it was, wherever it led me, good or bad. It was very freeing. And I felt that I had received some answers as to, where to start. It was forgiveness for me. I find the most hope watching my kids with people who just love them and teach them and are so dedicated to their well-being. Parker Hill has become a constant in my life, and Grace has become a constant in my family. So I want to tell you how much I appreciate you both with your commitment and your generosity for keeping that door of hope open.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How are you, my friend?
Good.
Nice to see you guys. All right. All good.
I mean, yeah, you guys know a little bit about us, but the home I grew up in, my parents were believers, but it wasn't exactly a Christian home. My dad had some major issues with anger. We dealt with a lot of mental and verbal and sometimes even physical abuse. I looked at God in the way of comparing him to my dad as just this angry tyrant, kind of jumped headlong into a relationship with a girl that was anything but God-honoring. Weekends were filled with just sleeping together and getting high and drunk or whatever, and that lasted for almost like 4 years. I just kind of numbed the pain of really just the lack of that affirmation, and just kind of kept searching for it. And my mom had been telling me that one bad year about Parker Hill, a co-worker of hers had been telling her about it. And I always brushed it off. And finally, after all that, I felt like it was time for me to take a step in a different direction. In June of 2007, I stepped through the doors at a Saturday night service. Immediately, it was just amazing. April 16th, 2011, there was the baptism scheduled. Mark had opened it up for anyone who wanted to jump in, and I did not hesitate. And also until that, really until that moment, I had not fully accepted Jesus.
Before I gave my life to Christ, I was doing a lot of drinking, and I was promiscuous, and I was in a very deep depression, kept making bad decisions, and so it just kept spiraling out of control, and I felt like I didn't know how to get out of it. For about a year, I was searching for a church. I grew up Catholic, so I wasn't sure what to look for. I was trying to read my Bible and didn't understand anything. I had friends that I would hang out with, and they didn't understand why I didn't drink anymore. They even made fun of me, so I felt alone. Then a few different instances led me to come to Parker Hill. I looked for the first female in the parking lot that was by herself. She's actually one of my best friends to this day. She was so nice and told me everything about the church. We walked in the front doors, and it was immediate that I felt like I belong here. This is exactly where I belong. I don't know where either of us would be without this church. I have a great opportunity to work on staff now, and I love it. And Justin's involved in serving with the students. I feel like I would still be lost if I wasn't here, and I would not have met Justin, and we would not have had our beautiful family. We would not have met you guys, and we would not have been a part of your small group, and we are just incredibly grateful.
Thank you guys for sharing, because sometimes like say you get the little card and you tell somebody about Parker Hill, and you don't know if it makes an effect on anybody of like, gosh, well, maybe they'll go, maybe they won't. Because Amy and I, sometimes that's what we struggle with. Sometimes it's like, oh, we should invite somebody, and it gets hard. And so to hear stories like, oh, you guys, this is like somebody invited you, to come along. Thank you for sharing that.
That was a nice surprise.
Yeah. So Pat and Amy, in 2006 and 2011, you and many other people took a step of faith and decided to give generously and invest in God's work in this church. And at that point, none of us knew what the future would hold. But since that time, hundreds of people have been affected by the ministry of this church, the people of this church. And tonight, you got to see just a small glimpse of a much bigger picture of what can happen when we get behind what God wants to do here in northeastern Pennsylvania. So on behalf of the folks who are here with us and hundreds of other people, thank you. Thank you for your generosity. And I believe the best is yet to come.